We are at the halfway point. I was going to say Mo's got to 13.1 miles, but we're actually running just a little bit ahead of schedule. But we will keep the momentum going and hand over next to Stewart McCain, who's, I'm sure, as you all know, our programme director for history. Stewart has written a book on the language question under Napoleon, which left me a little bit scratching my head because that's not an area of expertise that I have. But then he told me something that I did resonate with, and that is that he's run the Amsterdam half marathon in 2 hours and 8 minutes, a very creditable time. Stuart is going to be talking to us on populism and the politics of social grievance in the French Revolution. Stuart, over to you.
Yes, and I'll try and be quicker than 2 hours and 8 minutes. So, from Brexit to Donald Trump, to Jeremy Corbyn and the protests in Paris, populists have really transformed our political orders across the world in the last few years. What do we mean by this term, populist? It's fairly vague. It usually refers to a political ideology or a form of rhetoric in which people appeal to a morally virtuous people who are contrasted with a self-interested, corrupt, and venal elite. As I've watched this language of the people and elites become increasingly prominent in political debate, I really have been struck by some of the parallels with another historical context I'm very interested in, and one also characterized by crisis and change, and that is revolutionary France. People during the revolution in France didn't really use the term populist, although they did call people demagogues. But I think considering the way in which the people as a political concept was used during the revolution in France really offers us an interesting way of thinking about how we use political language today. So in the 1780s, France was in crisis. The monarchy was hugely indebted from wars fought with Britain throughout the 18th century, and it was struggling to raise enough taxes to cover these debts. This was complicated by tax exemptions enjoyed by those at the top of society. French society was broadly organized into 3 orders or estates. The clergy, the first estate because they're closest to God, the second estate, or the nobility or the aristocracy, and everybody else, the third estate, or the commons, the 99% in today's language. The French monarchy is struggling desperately during this period, the 1780s, to reform its political system, but it's blocked by the 2 privileged orders, by the first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility. In order to try and break this deadlock, the king called a meeting of the Estates General, which was a national political representative body that had last met in 1614, so over 150 years ago at this point. At the Estates General of 1614, each of the 3 orders, the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else, got a single collective vote. So this meant that if we organized it, if the French in 1789 had organized the Estates General in the same way they had 150 odd years earlier, the nobility and the clergy would have been able to outvote the 99% of the population. The result of this was outcry, and a variety of grievances emerged from France's very unequal politics and society, and these came to be expressed in ideas such as popular sovereignty. So, one very good example of this is the Abbé Sieyès in his famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? He argued that the commons, or the third estate, was a complete nation in itself, and that the privileged orders, the nobility and the clergy, were parasites. Here we already have some parallels with populism today, insofar as the object of the project was to further the interests of the people, who he claimed had long existed in a state of servitude exploited by the nobility, or our venal elites and experts. This idea was frequently expressed as a visual metaphor in prints. So on the left, you have the people being ridden by the king, the nobility, and the clergy. And on the left, you have the third estate represented as a peasant being ridden by the nobility and the clergy. So you can kind of really see this idea that the people are being exploited. Sayres's remedy was a change in France's political system. He argued when the Estates General met, the Third Estate should declare itself a national assembly and start working to give France a new constitution. And that's ultimately what happened. The events that followed marked the definitive entry of the people, in the form of the revolutionary crowd, into the history of the revolution. The king began mobilizing troops around Paris, provoking an armed insurrection, and eventually the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789. And this is still the French national holiday. If you go to France, everyone in Paris will be getting drunk and letting fireworks off in the streets. The storming of the Bastille is really important because it made it impossible for the king to launch a counter-coup against the revolutionaries. But it also came to be seen as the will of the people made manifest. And there followed a period in which politics came to mean enacting the will of the nation or the people. So this, I think, is clearly expressed in this kind of idea of the sans-culottes, of the people of Paris, who were defined explicitly in opposition to aristocrats, which is a kind of a general term that came to refer to all elites during this period, and not just those people with political privileges and titles. The very term sans-culotte, meaning without stockings, referred to the trousers worn by the working men of Paris, and people across France felt the need to present themselves as part of the people. And this meant wearing your hair long, rather than a wig, which was aristocratic, wearing the revolutionary cockade and red cap, and in terms of facial hair, this was really only acceptable when worn as a moustache. So you can see on the left these sans-culottes sporting moustaches because beards were considered counter-revolutionary. They were associated with religious orders. So what does this brief phase of radical democracy, even populist politics, tell us about populism more generally? Well, one thing I think it's worth pointing out is that it unites a really broad collection of people behind a common cause, often underlying an awful lot of tensions. So to return to our print of the three estates on the left, the third estate is represented as a peasant. Yet the third estate comprised almost all of the population of France. So from the very wealthiest trader or merchant to the poorest landless labourer. And these people often had very, very different interests. So to say that there is one single category, the people, is something of a simplification. I think the other thing to say is that as a form of political argument, it's often quite resistant to compromise. Because if a politician claims to be enacting the will of the people, anyone who disagrees must be a traitor or a saboteur. On the left, I've given you a satirical, on the right, I've given you a satirical image of the aristocratic Hydra, with a caption explaining that the Hydra drinks only blood and was last spotted at 4 p.m. on the road to Versailles. So I think this image is kind of ridiculing the idea that there's some aristocratic Hydra working against the people. But it shows how this concept of the aristocrat in political discourse functioned as a catch-all term to explain setbacks and castigate opposition. So I suppose the final thought I'll leave you with is this. Perhaps we should be just a little bit sceptical of those who claim to be acting with a clear knowledge of the will of the people.
Stuart, thank you. And to talk about France and politics and not mention the B word, I think is indeed very creditable. Thank you. The next